Today's daf is daf Lamed Tes, and we begin on the top of the daf with Omar Rabba. Shma mino kesher elyon deoraisa. Rabba wants to tell us that when you put the fringes, the strings into the hole, you have to tie it at least one kesher. Kesher elyon means that after you braid, which is called the krichos of all the strings, then on the bottom you put a kesher, a knot. And how do we know that this concept of a kesher, at least one kesher, is dorais, is a biblical requirement? So now by introduction, we're going to derive from psukim in the Torah that if you have what's called kilayim or sadin betzitzis, then it's permissible. Meaning, normally you cannot tie together in a garment or an attachment to a garment wool and linen. But in the case of tzitzis, the Torah permits it. And if you have a linen garment, you're allowed to put on tzitzis on the linen garment according to the Torah law, even though the tzitzis are made of wool. Says Rabbah, this is the logic, the analysis of Rabbah, if on the Torah level, there's no requirement of creating a kesher, of tying a knot, but let the strings just go through the hole on the corners, the four corners of the beged, and let them just hang down. Then, my itzrich lemishrei sadeh mitzitzis. Why did the Torah have to go out of its way to teach us that the normal prohibition of kilayim, of mixing and weaving together wool and linen, does not apply to tzitzis? Pshita. After all, if he's not tying them together, he's just looping them through the hole without any knotting. So then atokef tkifa achas eino chibur. Just if, let's say, you have a patch of linen and a patch of wool, two two pieces of cloth, and let's say you would put a stitch, a needle through the two stitches, through the two pieces of cloth, one of wool and one of linen, then that's not considered a chibur. That's not considered attached. There's no real weaving just because you pass the needle through these two. You have to at least make a knot. Therefore, we have to conclude that the Torah requires a knot, which in the case of a beged of sadin, a linen garment, means that by putting the strings of tzemer, right, tcheles tzitzis has to be made of tzemer, and putting them through the hole and then knotting them, you're in effect violating the Isur Kilayim. The Torah had to be matir that. But again, let's reiterate, if there was no requirement of knotting them together, then there's no kilayim here. There's no havamina that I would need to find a pasuk to be matir. Omar Rav bar Ada, Omar Rav Ada, Omar Rav, im nifsak hachut meikaro psula. We've discussed in yesterday's shir a concept called gardumim. And gardumim means that part of the strings of the tzitzis were torn off. Now we're making a statement that, let's say, one of the chutei tzitzis was torn off at the point where it goes into the beged, meaning there's nothing left of it. Then that's puzzle. Now, this statement, this ruling in the name of Rav, was passed on by Rav Nachman. Yosef Rav Nachman ka'amala shmaitata, he was relaying this ruling of Rav. And who was in the audience? It was Rava. Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman. Rava raises the following objection. He's got a brisa. The brisa says, "Ba'med dvarim amurim." When do we say that tzitzis have to be done with a certain midah, certain measurement? B'tchilaso. Only when you put the tzitzis onto the beged and insert it into the hole of the four garment of the four corners. Aval sofo, but later on, once the fringes, the chutim, have already been placed and attached to the garment, and later on they tear, then shirav v'gardumov kolshu. Now, we'll see as we go through the sugya that there are two ways of reading this. You could read it shurav v'gardumov as one, or shirav kama or gardumov as two separate entities. So my shirav umay gardumov. Right now the Gemara thinks that these are two different realities, two different descriptions. One is called shirav and one is called gardumov. And therefore we have to interpret what's the difference between shirav and gardumov. Shirav de ifsak minayu v'shtayr minayu. So the word shirav means that it wasn't completely torn off. Part of it still remains. But gardumov, therefore, as a separate category, separate description, is the gardumi gardume, where the string of the tzitzis was completely severed. And since it was originally a complete string, the fact that later on it became gardumov and there's nothing left to it, that doesn't invalidate the tzitzis. And that's a question on the string of Amoroim in the name of Rav, that if nifsak hachud meikaro psula. So the Gemara says, lo, chadaktoni. You shouldn't read it as shirav and gardumov as two separate entities, but rather it's one phrase, and you read it as shiurei gardumov, kol shehu. What it means is then, if you attach the two words together, shiurei gardumov, then it means that there are shirayim, there's still something left to the gardumov. So the gardumov means it was ripped, it was torn away, but shiurei means as long as there was a kol shehu, there was some minimum measure of shirayim, of remnants, of the leftover of this string of tzitzis after it was torn, then it's kosher. And that's not a contradiction to what we said in the name of Rav, that nifsak achut meikaro, which means there's nothing left and there's no remnants, is psula. So the Gemara asks the following question. This is probably Rava talking back to Rav Nachman, and says, V'lema gardumov, why do you bother with shirav? Lamali, leave out the word shirav. It just simply confuses us. And just have the word gardumov. And gardumov means that there is a stub left over, some remnant left over after the string was torn. And the Gemara answers, is Rav Nachman defending himself, ha kamashbon to be in shira gardumov k'dei lanvam. That the implication here of this brisa is to tell you that you need a serious shiurim after the gardumim. After it was torn off, you need a certain minimum size or length of the gardumim. And that's the significance of the word shirayim. So what is the minimum leftover part, the remnant after it was torn? It's got to be kedeli anvo, which means enough to make a knot out of it. Yosef Rabba v'ka'omer b'shmei derav chut shel kerech ola min aminyan. So what you have is, you have 8 strings, meaning 4 strings that are folded over to make 8, and you have to braid them. That's called korech or kricha. Now, one of the 8 strings is going to be used as the korech. In other words, that's the string, the thread that's going to go around and around the other threads. And now the question is, do you have to have an extra 9th thread to do the kricha, to wrap it around? And Rav is telling us, no, you don't need it. One of the 8 itself could go around and around, and it will serve as the korech, as the one that's tying or encircling all the other strings, and yet it's counted in the number eight. It's one of eight. Amalei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef points out to Rabbi, you mentioned this in the name of Rav, you made a boo-boo. Shmuel Amra, v'lo Rav. It was Shmuel who said this. And Itmar Namin, I'll support it because Amar Rav Bar Chana, Sachli Rav Yoshio Devin Usha, that Chut Shel Kerech Olo Min Minyan. That I heard from Rabbi Yosha in the name of Shmuel that the thread that's used to wrap around and do the krich on the other threads is also counted within the threads of the tzitzis. Yosef Rabba v'ka Omer Mishmei de Shmuel, another statement of Rabba in the name of Shmuel, Tcheles shekorach ruba kshera. Normally, the ratio between the parts of the strings that are the kricha, that make up the krichos, the rounder part, right, the encircled part, and the rest that hangs down as straight threads, is a ratio of 1/3 to 2/3. So 1/3 of the strings are krichos, and 2/3 are strings that come down. What he went ahead and he did was he braided rove of the tzitzis. So again, instead of 2/3, which would be hanging down as loose threads, he only had 1/3 hanging down as loose threads, because rove, meaning 2/3, were braided. Nevertheless, although he didn't do it in the ideal way, kshera. Amalei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef apparently heard this ruling in the name of Shmuel. Rav Hamra v'lo Shmuel. Again, just like we saw before, when Rabbi Bar Chana quoted something and attributed to Rav Yosef came forward and corrected him, saying it's really Shmuel. So too here in the second statement of Rabbi Bar Chana. Actually, I'm not 100% sure it's the same Rabbi, because one is Rabbi Bar Chana, the other is Rabbi, but it matters not. But it's really Shmuel. And Itmanami, Rav Yosef is going to prove this because Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshes, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav Tcheles shekarach ruba kshera. So 1 second, where do we see Shmuel here? Just 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay, so in the first case where Rabbi Bar Chana quoted in the name of Rav Yosef corrected him and said, no, it was Shmuel. In the second case where Rabbi said it in the name of Shmuel, Rav Yosef corrects him and he says in the name of Rav. Idmar Nami. Okay, that's what we have. Next, Rab Chia Bered Rav Nosson Masni Hochi. He had a different transmission of the ruling that we just learned about. And according to him, Amar Rav Huna, Rav Sheshes, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Marav, Tcheles shekarach ruba kshera. So far, it's just an identical repetition of what we had before, that even though he did 2/3 of kricha and only 1/3 of loose hanging down threads, it's still kosher, but now he adds, Vafilo karach ba el chuya achas kshera. Now we're going to see later on that the number of chulios, right? The chulios are, when you have a whole set of krichos, and then you have like a knot, and then you start another set of krichos. Each one of those sets of krichos are called a chulia. And we're going to see later on that the number of chulios is a very significant number, but Rav is telling us that as far as the critical number of chulios for being machshir, the tzitzis, all you need is one chulio. And noit cheles, however, if you want to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Zeh Keli Aveu and beautify your tzitzis, then shlish gedil ushnei shlish anaf. Right? Have it with krichos 1/3, and 2/3 are just fringes that hang down loosely. The kamashir chulya, the Gemara wants to know, okay, you determined that the minimum minimum is one chulya. How many krichos around and around will constitute one single chulya? Tanya, for this, we learned in a brayso in the name of Rebbe, Kadesh Yikroch v'yishna v'yishal. She only has to circle it 3 times around. So he goes around, around, and around, and that's a chulya. Tana, we learned in a brayso apoches, when you're counting the number of chulios, then it should be no less than 7. But again, as we said before, one chulya is absolutely critical, but if you want to do it in the right way, it should be at least 7 chulios. We don't have 7 chulios, by the way. We have 5, but the reason for that is because we don't have tchelis, but we'll get back to that later. Anyway, Hamosif, if let's say he wants to add more than 7 chulios, then there's a ceiling. Hamosif lo yosef at shloshisrei, not more than 13. Hapoches lo yivchos misheva, and why is it that the minimum is 7 chulios? And all this has to do with the fact that when you look at the tcheles, it's meant to remind you of the color of Shomayim, the blue color of the heavens. And how many heavens are there? Kineged Shiva Rekiim. There are 7 heavens. Now, in between each heaven, there's a certain amount of space. Hamosif lo yosef at shloshisrei. And why is it that if you want to add above and beyond 7 chulios, you shouldn't go beyond 13? That's the ceiling. Keneged Shiva Rekiim. As we said before, there are 7 heavens, and then there are Shisha Avirim Shebineim. Meaning, in between the 7, you'll have 6 spaces of air, and if you add 6 to 7, the whole picture gives you 13. And if you go beyond that, it's no longer reminiscent, that it doesn't correspond to the heavens. And the idea is that tzitzis should remind you of the heavens. Tana, we learned in a brayso, kshu maskil b'lovan. Okay, he's making the krichos, and he takes one string to encircle all the other strings, and he starts with lavan. He starts with a white thread. Now, it's really interesting because the Torah gives more significance to the white thread than it does to the one single tcheles thread. So you have many, many white threads. According to the Rambam Shita, you have 7 out of 8 are white, and only 1 is tcheles. Or according to, let's say, the Ravid Shita, it's 6 and 2. So according to many Rishonim, you'll have less tcheles than you have lavan. Lavan is predominant. Now, truth is, even if you hold like Rashi and Tosfos, that's 2 and 2, which means 4 and 4, is nevertheless, the Torah says, first put on the white thread. And we've discussed this already in the past, that the Torah requires that first you attach the white threads to the garment. Hakanaf min hakanaf. So we're assuming, again, you have to put this in a historical context, that in those days they wore white garments. And the kanaf, min kanaf, means that the threads of the tzitzit should be the same color as the beged itself. Therefore, the threads of the tzitzit should be white. Ukshu Messiah beloved. Now, in between the first one that he puts in and the last one that he puts in the tcheles. Again, whether it's 1, whether it's 2, whether it's 4, whatever the number might be. But he should always end up with lavan. And why is that? Because the lavan, the white, has a greater significance, more prominent, it's more kadosh, and we have a principle called Ma'ila b'kodesh v'lo moridin. If you would end up with the tcheles, then it would look like you went down in kedusha instead of going up. And that's where the Gemara points out, Ma'ilin Kodesh v'lo morid. Let me just see if he adds anything here. Yeah, it's more or less what we said before. I just find this fascinating that, I was always under the impression with all these people wearing tcheles now. I don't know, Steve, if you wear tcheles, I don't wear tcheles, but those people wear tcheles. I was always under the impression that they thought tcheles was more important than lavan. But that's not so. Lavan is more important than tcheles. In fact, that's why we still have the mitzvah of tzitzis today without tcheles. Rabba Bar Chana, Rav and Havi Yasve, they were teaching. Havi Kacholifi Azalu Gavra, a certain person went by, and he was wearing a very strange kind of pair of tzitzis. The Michvase Glima de Kulat Chilta. Michse, he covered his body with a glima. A glima is a cloak that was made 100% pure tchelis. Virami le tchelta. And all his tzitzis were tchelis. Now, offhand, he did the right thing because we said that kanaf min kanaf, meaning the strings of the tzitzis should reflect the same color as the beged. So it makes sense that if his garment was made of tcheles, that his tzitzis should make of tcheles. But as we go on, we'll see that that's not necessarily so.